I'm Nick Giordano. I'm Vice President and Counsel for Global Government Affairs with the National Pork Producers Council in the United States. I'm based in Washington, D.C. My talk is about the United States pork industry, opportunities, where we are today, and opportunities and challenges that we face going forward. Well, the population in the world and disposable incomes are growing. The middle class by 2030 is going to double in size. So there's tremendous opportunity. And the first thing people do when they have money is they eat. They get more money. They switch to meat-based diets. There's opportunity not just for US producers, not just for British producers, but for meat producers all over the world. And I think sometimes, given the ebb and flow of markets, that's lost on people, but looking at the big picture, there's tremendous opportunity ahead for meat producers in the world. We represent about 60,000 producers across the United States. We've got about 20 states we're very big in. We represent big producers, so our biggest stakeholder being Smithfield Foods, largest hog producer and pork producer in the world, and by our standards, smaller producers. Also, I guess by the world standards, maybe medium-sized producers. My board is largely made up of independent family farmers, but we've got a variety of people on the board reflecting our industry. We are voluntarily funded, unlike some of you might be familiar with our sister organization, the National Pork Board. We are voluntarily funded. And what we do is we protect our producers' freedom to operate. So we want freedom of choice for our producers. And that really means freedom of non-science-based government interference and government mandates so that they can produce in the way they want, with the tools they want, as long as it's animal-friendly and good for animal health and human health. They should have that right. And so our job, we view not just in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, but around the world. Our mission is to try and keep governments and overregulation and that sort of thing from burdening our producers. My background is I'm not like most of you and most of my board. I am not a farm boy. I'm from New Jersey. Little did I know when I was a kid growing up in the streets of New Jersey, I'd have the opportunity to work for U.S. pork producers, which are just a marvelous bunch of people, and I get to do very interesting things like come around the world and meet interesting folks like you. I'm a lawyer lobbyist, so I'm not a production person. My specialty is international affairs and trade, but the past 2 years I've been involved in all our policy issues. So immigration, labor force issues, tax, all the sci-tech issues, and a lot of issues that we're engaged in. My message in a nutshell is, and you can take it in the context of Brexit or just the context of going forward, is, and Richard touched on this, we have growing global demand. I mean, how many times did he mention the word China, right? I doubt imports represent more than 10% of Chinese consumption at this point. I think pork is about 15% of the CPI in China, right? Cost of production is really high there. So some of you may think relatively, you've got a high cost of production. Costs are really high there. They're going up. They have environmental constraints. If you did an overlay of where their industry for the most part is located, like on the map of the US, it would be our Northeast corridor, so from Washington up to Boston. Got a lot of animal health challenges, a lot of challenges. So they're going to have to import more. I mean, if the choice is between unacceptably high food prices or import more, I think we all know what they're going to do. So in and of itself, China is a great opportunity, and Richard mentioned Asia, right? Well, it's the fastest growing economic region in the world, and the middle class in the world is gonna more than double in the next 15 years. That's opportunity knocking for every person in this room. And I understand that, you know, you've got Brexit, and a lot of you are troubled by that, and I understand you're losing the EU, it's a huge market, but I would challenge you, those of you who can afford to, look, I work for a trade association, so I get paid to think long term. But those of you who are gonna be around for a while, I think there's a lot of opportunity that's yet to come. I've got a couple slides here, just I think most of you know this, but we're getting more from less in the United States, increasingly productive, less farms and more production. Richard mentioned the fact that we had we did a really great job of managing PEDV, and the upshot was a lot of people made a lot of money, and so they're reinvesting. The industry is focused in our Midwest, and that's because that's where the corn and the soybeans is. North Carolina is somewhat of an exception, and that's because when the tobacco industry moved out of eastern North Carolina, the pork industry moved in. I had our top 10 states listed there. I'd say it's about 20 states where we've got pretty significant political clout in the U.S. We're a pretty big player on policy issues in the U.S. So for a policy geek like me, it's very interesting. I never thought when I left private practice, I thought I'd be with pork producers maybe 3 or 4 years when I left private legal practice. And you know, now 20-something odd years later, there's a lot of interesting issues. Why are we increasing? Well, you know, growing population and incomes are a lot of it. You know, we've got the corn and the soybeans and the factors of production in the U.S. I mentioned we did a really good job of managing PEDV. Here's where and this is, again, where our top 10 production states, and you can see that that's where these new plants that Richard mentioned are going in. So 2 of them, the white stars, are retrofitted older plants. I mean, they're going to be new production, but they're smaller, they're retrofitted. The 3 yellow are much bigger commercial-sized plants. And I think in terms of Richard talking about, he used the example of, you know, 2 different European exporters, and one was just all about meeting the customer specs. I think the U.S. industry is really all over the board, and people have different business models and so on. I think my guess is, though, some of these smaller plants, and increasingly we're seeing in the U.S. more of a boutique mindset. I don't know what the organics numbers are here in the U.K. or EU, probably higher than the U.S. It's only 6% in the U.S., so that's not, and we're still haggling over what that term really means. But in terms of boutique, meaning Asia and meeting customer demands, I think you're going to see that more and more from the U.S. And my colleague here from Denmark, they've had to do this. I mean, they're fabulous at doing this because they have to export most of their production. For the U.S., you know, we're as good as we've done exporting. We're only exporting about 25% of our production. I think most of our growth in coming years will be outside the U.S. But we haven't had, since we're such a big country with a pretty affluent market, for a lot of us, and not just in the pork industry, lots of sectors, we haven't had to think globally, and we do now. And that's where all our growth is going to be. So I mentioned that, well, maybe I didn't, but I will tell you, trade has been great for us. The reason this starts at 1989, because That's the year of the first major U.S. bilateral free trade agreement, and that was the U.S.-Canada agreement, which was the precursor to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And you can see that as we've gotten access through trade agreements, we've done very well. And so well, in fact, that the U.S. has 20 implemented free trade agreements. We export more pork from the United States to those 20 nations than to the rest of the world combined. And when you figure that the rest of the world includes Japan, which is our #1 value market, and China, which is the top market, it's really remarkable. So we've been in the, as I said, we're in the middle of a lot of policy discussions in the U.S. on trade. We've been in the absolute middle. I think if you quizzed Mike Froman, the U.S. trade ambassador from the last administration, on, what top 5 or what were the top 3 organizations most intimately involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, I'm sure he would tell you if pork wasn't #1, it would be in Michael's top 3. And unfortunately, we were big fans of that agreement, spent a lot of capital, and our new president was the first executive order he issued, pulling the U.S. out of that. So that's a hurdle for us. Grain prices are very favorable, which are helping to fuel expansion in the U.S. So challenges, again, not as exposed as Denmark or the UK or some of the other pork exporting countries in the EU, but we're increasingly exposed. And so that's a big concern. And got retaliation at the top of the list. You might know that the United States, Canada, and Mexico are involved in a renegotiation of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. We've been in the middle of that. We just released, and if you want to know something about the NAFTA, we released a major white paper about a week and a half ago on that topic. Negotiations the Trump administration just sent the notification up to our Congress. So by this summer, negotiations in earnest will begin. Another good kind of marker to look at is today, the U.S. and Mexico are expected, hopefully, will announce a deal on sugar. And while that's just one little product, we're hoping that it's a solution that all the parties can rally behind and get some momentum going into the NAFTA modernization. So, it would be really harmful to us if we lost our zero tariff access in Mexico. It would be very disruptive. And of course, foreign animal disease is a big concern, as is geopolitical instability, losing a market, not through disease or trade retaliation, but simply because they can't import anymore, right? So like, Venezuela, for example, isn't importing very more. It used to be, back in the day, it was a pretty good market for the United States, not for our industry, but for a lot of others. So that's a concern. And Richard mentioned, and I think you all know, the strength of the dollar. So it's great for me being over here now. Our dollar's really strong. And then opportunities, there's a lot of them. I mentioned this before. So the middle class more than double in the next 15 years. It's great opportunity. You hear a lot of controversial things, I'm sure you get in the media about the U.S. One of the really positive things is we're having a serious discussion about regulatory reform, which is long overdue. And, we're over-regulated. Maybe by Brussels standards we're not, but by science standards we are. And we don't want to become what I think you have in Brussels, and that is regulations that are not based on science, but are driven by NGOs and others that don't really care what you think. And members of the commission and the parliament, they care about what these NGOs think. Now, we've got the NGOs, but this, obviously broader than the meat industry. This is an economy-wide discussion going on, and we're very involved in it, and we're very supportive, and we're hoping tax reform is another big issue in the United States, and it's long overdue. The irony of a lot of what, if you had all followed the discussion, the political discussion between the two presidential candidates, Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump, there was a lot of anti-trade talk, and the irony is the key reason the United States has been losing manufacturing jobs is not because of trade deals. In fact, we're gaining jobs because of trade deals. And the trade deficit's a big discussion. Actually, we mentioned 20 implemented FTAs. I don't have the slide in the slide set, but we actually, our deficit is with our non-FTA countries. If you look, I've charted over time what happens to our deficit, to our trade deficit when we have a free trade agreement. It gets reduced. So we have virtually no deficit with the 20 FTA countries. We've been losing jobs. The number one reason is technological innovation. So in agriculture, in the year 1900, 40% of the workforce in the United States was engaged in agriculture. 100 years later, 1.9%. Really hard pressed to make an argument that imports were the reason. It's technological innovation. And that's the key reason, and there's some studies that have been done that substantiate that, and I think any credible economist in the United States or globally will tell you that. But then, this brings me to tax. We have an uncompetitive tax code in the U.S., and we haven't had tax reform since 1986. So when you combine the fact that there's an incentive for our companies to move offshore, along with overregulation, that competitiveness issue, particularly in American manufacturing, those factors more appropriately are the reason for the problem, not trade. And of course, we've been busy telling that story in the United States. So we're pretty bullish going forward. I mean, there's always ups and downs, but again, I have the luxury, and our job is to think long term, and we think the trends are pretty good. We've had to compete more with Europe because Richard talked about Russia. You all know what's gone on there, and they want to be self-sufficient, and we were all thrown out of the market. And of course, Europe had more of that market than the US or Canada, but it's impacted, obviously, the way we compete in third country markets. But I think, that's a short-term phenomenon, and really, regardless of whether or not those policies continue and whether they even get into export markets, I think when you look at the Asia-Pacific region and other regions in the world, the demand is growing, and incomes are going up, and, if you're a pork producer, right, pork is the #1 meat consumed in the world. I'm bullish. And then finally, wrapping up with the politics. So you want to understand a lot of what's going on. It's right here, okay? This part of the United States. And Republicans hadn't won these states for a long time. And it's maybe somewhat disparagingly referred to in the United States as the Rust Belt. A little bit unfair, but that's what it's called. And then, it's really kind of, what does the union guy want, right? And this president doesn't want to touch entitlements. There are lots of people in the Republican Party, starting with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul Ryan, that would like to touch entitlements. But I don't see Trump behind that. So don't touch entitlements, increase military spending, fight terror, limit immigration, limit imports, push back against corporate titans and coastal elites. And I will tell you, there really is, I think a lot of people, you know, I'm not a naive person, so I'm well educated, I have money, I guess I'm an elite, right? But there really is in the United States this strong undercurrent of elitism, and that clearly was part of the backlash in this election, and it's a long-term phenomenon. There's a lot of, you know, people give a lot of respect to mainstream publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on. Some people do. The fact of the matter is, and I don't have the slide with me, but the average person in the United States trusts the president more than these mainstream publications. So the elite in the U.S. Look, we have issues with these people too, because a lot of these people have a bias that we think is not science-based. You know, the first ones to talk about the climate issue, which we don't take a position, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'll just tell you, for people that seem to want to hide behind science on one issue, and then when it comes to other issues, they're running for the hills and they don't want to talk about science. So if I had to sum it up, the focus, so on the positive agenda and what we're focused on, because regardless of who's in the White House, we have to work with them, right? So that's what we're focused on domestically, cutting regulation and taxes. You know this. He's not very popular, but guess what? The people that voted for him still support him. This is a little dated, but he's still got a lot of support. And then finally, guess what? So if you follow U.S. politics at all, you know that for the past, I don't know, 75 years or so, the Republican Party has been associated with open, expanded free trade. The Democrats have some more big business. The Democrats more unions and protection. Well, it's really flipped in the polls, and it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see whether this is going on. And a lot of the young voters, the millenniums, one of the big problems Republicans have is everything they really needed to do going forward for the future. So grow the young vote, grow the Asian vote, grow the Hispanic vote, and so on. They didn't do. And, you know, you just wonder, so is this a long-term trend? We don't know. We track this closely, and Dems as a whole the past 3 years have been more supportive of trade than Republican voters.